everyone. Welcome to the Community Classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. And we're going to be addressing a very serious issue this evening, this morning, whenever you are listening to this. And that serious issue is the fact that many of you are on a direct path to self-destruction. And you are taking the fast train on social media and particularly YouTube en route to this self-destruction. Now, a number of individuals have attempted to address these issues on YouTube, and this has been over the course of time. The first, from my recollection, would be LENON. The other one would be Dr. Rick Wallace. Another one would be Pharaoh Said That. Dr. Claude Anderson has touched on some things over time, and most recently, Attorney Shabazz. And so we're going to address a number of issues that perhaps some people may not be aware of, and perhaps some people have not been prepared to deal with. And so sometimes what happens is that the message may come in different forms and from different vantage points and from different people, but not everyone can receive the message from everyone. And so when the student is ready, the teacher shows up. And so for some of you, it may be that I am the teacher that shows up for those of you who have not been able to hear previously. And the topics we're going to address are very serious. And so one of the things we're going to address is the issue of quote unquote black on black hate group dynamics and crimes on YouTube and on the internet, and why certain behaviors look like hate group actions. And so it would be intra-racial hate group activity. And so we're going to do a forensic analysis of the behavior and dynamics that present in that way. That means we're going to look at some of the psychological and the legal issues. We're going to look at issues like cyberbullying and how some of the subscribers, also known as fans for some of you, actually flame some of this dysfunction. We're going to look at this issue of rights because that comes up quite a bit. People talk a lot about their rights on the internet, but very little about their responsibilities. And so we're going to also address, we're going to wrap this up with why many of you need to check yourselves before you continue on that path of self-destruction. And for those of you who learn best by using scripture, we'll have some scripture at the end. We'll also use some graphic artwork and musical extrapolations for those of you who cannot hear the message any other way.
Back in the 60s, our brothers and sisters were hanged. How could you gang bang? I never ever ran from the Ku Klux Klan, and I shouldn't have to run from a black man, cause that's self-destruction. Yeah, it was self-destruction.
Now, while it may not be clear to many of you what the dynamics look like are quote unquote black on black hate groups and hate crimes online. And so one way to look at it is this idea of the enemy within. And it's very unfortunate that this discussion even has to take place on the internet, on YouTube. I don't think that many people realize that when they place things on the internet, that those things are available not just for their small group, but those things are then made available for the billions of people on this earth. And so when those things happen, when people are acting out publicly, the only way to address that is publicly. And so we're going to delve into this issue of what looks very much like black on black hate groups and hate crimes right on YouTube. And we're also going to look at the issue of why some people feel so comfortable acting out that behavior in such a public space. Now, while many of you discuss the idea of being an endangered species in terms of what you consider to be global white supremacy, one of the things that many of you are apparently forgetting is that part of the reason that many of you are an endangered part of a species is that some of this is, if you will, self-inflicted. And so there are some self-inflicted wounds, meaning basically that black on black psychological targeting, predation, right here on the internet, right out in public. And so there's this unusual love-hate dynamic going on where individuals are forming into little groups, little collectives, and engaging in in-group, out-group behavior where there's in-group love. That means love for the people that are in their little group, their little subgroup. And then there's out-group hate. And so anyone who does not belong in that little in-group becomes the target for hate. And so there's also this sense of intergroup threat. So anyone who is not within the group is treated with animosity and aggression. And there's also this dynamic of having irrational hate towards those who are not like self along some dimension. And we're going to talk about what those dimensions are and why that looks like hate group activity. And the only reason that this has been going on as long as it has is because it is intra-racial. If this were cross-racial, there would be a different dynamic going on. But because it is quote unquote black on black, it goes unnoticed, unacknowledged, and unaddressed. In fact, one of the common dynamics is when you're talking about a group of people who experience themselves as being oppressed, one of the things that happens is that individuals tend to sort of round the wagons when there is someone who is acting out. And so there is this belief, this assertion that people should stick together, even when sticking together means sticking together with their abuser, with the perpetrator. And this is exceedingly dysfunctional.
The only person talking about love and brother is the preacher. And it seems nobody's interested in learning but the teacher.
And one of the things that is noteworthy is that for all of the rhetoric of solidarity and uplifting that goes on in some of these communities online, those are the very individuals that seem to be extremely focused on tearing people down and destroying others that they claim to love and claim to want to have solidarity with. And so in many ways, the dynamics look very much like a domestic violence relationship where the individual perpetrators feel free to abuse and menace and have every expectation that those that they are abusing will stay in the relationship out of obligation, out of this sense of solidarity, out of this sense of shared oppression. And so in getting people to feel guilty about not wanting to have that solidarity, there is the push for people to pretty much abandon their own best interest in the interest of this fictitious community that often presents itself as highly conscious, but lacking oftentimes in conscience.
Gives me some knowledge, I'm buying some shoes, and if they black spend all their money on big colleges, still most of y'all come out confused. Go ahead, Mr. Wynn.
Okay, based upon experiences from the past week, there were lots of questions based upon a review that was done of a video, and And so there's the question of, how does she know? So I'm going to answer, how does she know that she is seeing what she is seeing, and that she is Dr. McCarthy? And so Dr. McCarthy has been teaching for a few decades. Dr. McCarthy has approximately 30 years plus in the field of mental health and forensics. And Dr. McCarthy has conducted over 2,000 psychological and forensic evaluations. And so Dr. McCarthy is pretty familiar with psychological dynamics and forensic dynamics, developmental dynamics, and problems related to identity and adjustment and domestic violence. Dr. McCarthy is also very familiar with juvenile delinquency, and she wrote her dissertation, her doctoral dissertation, on delinquency in African American male children. And so one of the things that Dr. McCarthy is seeing online is a significant amount of juvenile behavior masquerading as adult male behavior. And these adult males are basically presenting a model for young males who may be on YouTube and in social media looking for role models. And so some of the things that I have taught, these are a few of the classes that I've taught over the years, and some of them are very important in terms of this discussion. And so some of the important classes would be human development, adolescent psychology, personality theory, abnormal psychology, psychology of adjustment, constructs of social identity, and images and messages in the media. Some other things that are very important for some of you would be criminal litigation and forensics. And in the forensics field, and by the way, forensics is my specialty. I'm both a psychologist and an attorney, but I specialize in clinical psychology and forensics. And so I have taught psychology and law, that relationship, forensic psychology, looking at evidence and assessment, domestic violence, juvenile delinquency, and psycholegal assessment. And perhaps most important for this discussion is that I have created classes on harassment, discrimination, and bullying, and law, diversity, and justice. And so we're going to touch on some of those issues in this discussion to help you to understand. And yes, by you, I mean, if you feel like this is about you, it probably is about you. And so this will hopefully help you to understand how your behavior and your dynamics, individually or collectively, might be construed in ways that are not going to be helpful for you, and have likely not been helpful for other people experiencing it.
Well, today's topic, self-destruction. It really ain't the rap audience that's bugging. It's one or two suckers, ignorant brothers, trying to rob and steal from one another. You get caught in the mid.
Okay, what we're going to look at to give you an idea of what behaviors, whether it's you or whether you're witnessing this or whether you are being subjected to it, we're going to talk about the 7-stage hate model. Of course, Dr. McCarthy added the R because it's the hater model. And so we've got the 7 stages of the hate model. And so basically what it looks like, and this is for those of you who require sources and those of you who require primary sources. And so here's the primary source for you, straight from the FBI. And also I am a primary source. And so I don't always need sources because I have a plethora of experience and knowledge. And so I'm quite equipped to form my own independent opinion of these things and share those with you. Okay, so the first thing is that some of the behaviors are collusive and conspiratorial. And so what's happening is that you have individuals abusing people online. And perhaps in the real world, they are not acting alone. And so that's one of the first things to note, is that you see individuals doing things, abusing other people online, and they are not acting alone. Sometimes they have a lot of aliases, so they might have several channels. They often have lots of friends and colleagues that are more than willing to engage in this behavior with them. There is a tendency, just like with hate groups, to have symbols and rituals and all sorts of mythology. And so they'll have symbols to represent their particular little collective, all sorts of little ritualistic behaviors, and all sorts of mythology about their little group. And this basically serves to boost the individual and the group's self-esteem. And it also increases this idea of outgrouping. And so when they target an individual or a group of people, and often what is seen is group behavior, when they do that targeting, they are able to boost their own self-esteem by falling back on these symbols and these rituals and these myths about who they are. And also another thing is this issue of hate being the glue. And so the thing that is keeping the group together is basically this idea of hate. And so they have this collective sense of hate and debasement for the target. So whoever it is that they have targeted, those individuals serve as sort of the glue. That's they give rise to the hate. And so that keeps that hate group dynamic going. They have a target, and that hate is what keeps them together. One of the other things that you'll notice is that the groups, the individuals, are highly active and taunting. They have a very low tolerance for boredom, very low tolerance for inactivity, no downtime, constantly on the go, constantly seeking out people to harass, constantly seeking out people to abuse. They do not stop. The other thing, number 5, would be they're very aggressive and prowling and thrill seeking. And so what you'll see is a lot of verbal violence, constantly targeting, constantly attempting to provoke, constantly defaming people and saying derogatory things about people and groups. And there's also a tendency in the real world for those types of individuals collectively to become physically violent, because ultimately, just like in psychopathy situations and other bullying situations and narcissistic situations, the idea is destruction. And so if they can emotionally destroy the person, if they can destroy their career, if they can destroy their family, if they can destroy the person, they really don't care. Their focus is on destruction. Their focus is on annihilating the person. They'll use language like they destroyed someone. There was a comment and there was an uproar last week about comments about Islam. And so there was an attack on individuals because they were Islamic from some members of these little collectives. And so one of the things that people need to think about is that this process, this hater model, it looks very much like group bullying that you see in schools, that you might see in the home, or that you even see in workplaces. And you can look at what Cat Williams says. Basically, the job of a hater is to hate. And, haters are gonna hate. And so that's what you see a lot of, just very much fueled by that. But often, interestingly, it's couched in well-meaning good doing. And so the explanation for the behavior is usually that they are doing a good thing. Many have convinced themselves that they are championing some sort of cause, and that without their intervention, things would go awry. And so they are called, this is their higher calling, to actually abuse people.
When the bomb comes down, you gotta stand your ground and stop pulling your own kind down. You need to stop clowning. So I'ma raise my hand for power. YZ is thinking of a master plan.
Now, of course, YZ talks about thinking of a master plan, and typically a more positive master plan than those who are engaged in this online cyberbullying, hate group, hate crime dynamic. And we're going to talk about why this stuff looks like a hate crime. But first, we're going to talk about some of the underlying forensics so that you can get an idea whether you are engaged in this behavior, whether or not you are on the receiving end of this behavior. And so the psychology that is going on for many people that is being manifested is a significant amount of grandiosity and narcissism, a significant amount of egocentrism, ethnocentrism, and low perspective taking. And there's also this dynamic of megalomania, also laced with a lot of naivete. There are feelings of disdain that are being evidenced, feelings of envy, very low sense of empathy, and extreme anger, low and no sense of guilt or shame, feeling like individuals can just do anything. There's a lot of manipulation, a lot of coerciveness, whether we're looking at overt or covert sort of criminal, quasi-criminal tort problems and contract violations, targeting people for contracts that are not going to be fulfilled. And so that issue has come up quite a bit, and it has come up, there's a recent issue that has come up with YouTubers. And sometimes what's happening is that money issue with YouTube also. So people are competing for money, and many people are willing to do just about anything for money. And so they will present any type of content as long as it will bring in subscribers and revenue. They do not care. They will often sell all sorts of things on YouTube when they have no intention on fulfilling those obligations, no intentions whatsoever. And so particularly when they have targeted groups for this type of scamming behavior that keeps coming up. And so that's the psychology that's going on. And some of the things that individuals don't understand is that even though people are on YouTube, they are still under the jurisdiction of the laws in the United States. And because they do things online, they sometimes inadvertently, without understanding it, place themselves under the jurisdiction of multiple places, including federal jurisdiction and including international law jurisdiction. And so you have a number of people who are acting out and doing all sorts of things, and they have not a clue about what they are doing or the ramifications for what they are doing. So they may be doing something in one state, and the person or the group that they have targeted, they're in a variety of other states. And when those individuals turn on their computers and they're impacted in those other states, well, they have basically just reached out and touched, and in many instances placed themselves under the jurisdiction of another state in which they have not even possibly been in before. Okay, so what the law does, if people are curious about how the law and psychology all fit together. So psychology is about thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And the law, in terms of forensics, is about controlling behavior. And so the law looks to create parameters for behaviors. In other words, behavioral boundaries. The law seeks to create prohibitions about behavior. So there are behavioral rules of conduct related to omission and commission. That means doing something or failing to do something when someone is legally obligated to do something. And the law is also concerned with interventions, and that is behavioral cessation and control. And so that's how the law fits in with psychology. Both are concerned with behaviors, but one is concerned more with understanding the behaviors that we just talked about, and the other is more concerned with controlling behavioral outgrowths of what we've been talking about.
Headliner, I told you to give him a horseshoe. I gave him a horseshoe. Now I see the importance of history. While my people be in the mess that they be. Many journeys to freedom made in vain by brothers on the corner playing ghetto games. I ask you, Lord, why you enlighten me without the enlightenment of all.
And some may be wondering about this black on black dynamic, or black on brown, or brown on brown, or however you want to phrase it. One of the things that is becoming increasingly clear is that with the targeting is that it's one of those issues that people are not talking about in terms of heritage. People want to believe that the individuals in the United States, in the Americas, that they are a monolith. And the fact of the matter is that they are not a monolith. And it's probably one of the reasons why there will definitely never be any of this unity that people talk about all of the time, this international Pan-Africanism unity. Part of the reason is that people are not understanding that the collective of people that are on this continent are made up of, even though they may all be brown, they are actually made up of slave owners and slave traders and slave traitor descendants. And so what you have in some of the dynamics, it looks like those who might be a little bit more clear about their ancestry, and they may be a little bit more clear about the fact that they are descended from slave owners and slave traders, and those who would be considered in the upper echelon of society. And they have targeted those who may have more unknown or ambiguous histories, which would be reminiscent of those who were quote unquote black and enslaved or indigenous. And so you have multiple groups operating. And so you have indigenous Africans and indigenous Caribbean individuals. You have Euro-Africans, also some individuals known as Luso-Africans. You have Afro-Asiatic folks, and you have indigenous Americans. And you also have individuals who have that one drop. If those of you who remembering the Nordicism video and the colorism and Nordicism video, you will perhaps recall dynamics that take place when that one drop is there, and how that can play into a lot of dynamics. And so while many people talk about unity and everyone needs to stick together, there was a previous video that we did that was on inter-ethnic, intra-racial violence and analogizing that with domestic violence. Well, it's the same thing that's going on. And at the end of the video, there was an admonition of the fact that there will not be any of that unity simply based upon skin color. You have different dynamics, different heritages, different ancestral narratives going on. And some of the individuals with brown skin, they have an oral history. Those indigenous Americans, the Indians in America, they have an oral history. And because individuals are ignoring and pretending that the American Indians are all very light, looking like one droppers, they are not availing themselves to the oral tradition, to the actual history. Many people are not even availing themselves to just the standard history, which actually tells the history of the American Indians and what they endured. They have not taken the time to find out that many of those American Indians look very much like people that they are identifying as African American. And so there's a total disrespect of that history and a total disrespect for the fact that many of the brown people in the Americas who came from Europe and Africa were actually the perpetrators of the abuse of the American Indians. And so you'll hear a lot of discussion about, oh, the Indians owned slaves too. You might want to find out about which Indians owned slaves and under what circumstances those Indians owned slaves. And you also might want to start to look at your own history to better understand what was going on in terms of your ancestral narrative in relation to the indigenous people in both America and in Africa, and as well as the Caribbean. So that would be the Americas, incorporating everything. Okay, and one of the things that people need to note is that there is a dynamic where what would be considered the descendants of American chattel slavery, so those who identify as African Americans, the individuals in the community often target those individuals for sort of replacement. And so there is almost an identity theft dynamic that is going on. It's been going on YouTube for a while, where individuals who are not African American are presenting as African American and creating all manner of havoc and chaos on the internet. And so the way they do that, and we've talked about this before, is it may be a male who pretends to be an African American male. Also known as an indigenous male for some people. This person poses as an African American male or even an African American female and creates havoc on the internet, knowing full well that they are not African American. And what happens is that those who are African American believe that the individuals are African American, and they respond to that belief. And so there has been this extreme creation of animosity based upon this identity theft. And this identity theft, quite frankly, is coming from individuals who would be coming from the continent of Africa. Not those who tend to remain in Africa, but those who tend to travel away from Africa. But primarily, this is coming from the Caribbean. And so there is this unusual dynamic of targeting an entire group of people for this bizarre dynamic of predation. And people are not talking about it because it's politically incorrect to say anything about anyone who is considered quote unquote black in any public space or even personally. And so it has become taboo to even confront the fact that these dynamics are going on. But we are going to overcome that taboo because this behavior has become completely outrageous and it has become completely destructive. And many of those who claim to be in the conscious community very much are tied to the Caribbean and very much tied to this dynamic. And so there is a lot of rhetoric about uplifting, but then there's also the, breaking things apart. And those individuals are also the ones who often are attacking even their own quote unquote countrymen. And so there have been a couple of instances where individuals have been abused who even have been from the Caribbean by individuals in the community based upon the individuals identifying as either Aboriginal, identifying as Taino, Arawak, identifying as Hebrew, identifying as Christian, identifying as anything that the collective in this community deems, anybody that they deem an outsider, anybody that they deem beneath them, anybody that they deem in need of correcting or corralling or abusing. And again, there's always a good explanation for it. And there are also individuals who identify as African American who tend to join in with this. So this is not something that is going on, in a vacuum. It is a very unusual dynamic, and there is a huge confederacy going on. Interesting term. And so because the relationship is an abusive one, it's a very backstabbing one, because in one way there is a smiling in the face and presenting as being a part of this unified collective, when in fact that's not what's going on. And often the other part of this which is what unifies the people, is a form of African narcissism. It's all things African, and anything that is not African is belittled, is maligned. That goes for people, that goes for religion, that goes for culture. And so the task appears to be having people capitulate and actually abandon whatever their identity is in order to fall in line with whatever identity these individuals deem that they should have. Okay, you've heard that phrase flag on the play before. And so we're going to talk about that red flag, those things that are extremely problematic, and they are part of this sort of formula for what is going on in terms of this group dynamic. And so one of the first things that's happening is that you're seeing individuals and groups targeting other groups. And they are, I've seen everything from targeting Christians to targeting Muslims to targeting Hebrews to targeting indigenous people. There's just women, men. There is a targeting of these groups, and there is a tendency to target based upon ethnicity. So not race, but ethnicity. So national origin and whether or not a person is indigenous or not. There has been a heavy focus on indigenous people, American Indian people, people who identify that way, people who are searching. There's also this unusual dynamic of both despising and deifying white people and despising American, quote unquote, black people. There's another dynamic with a race that involves interracial dating and placating, but at the same time, cross-racial hating. And so a claim for hating across the races, but at the same time being significantly involved with, in terms of a dating or marriage relationship with someone of another race. There is this anti-religion focus, and this is on the surface. And so again, it's this non-Christian, non-Hebrew, non-Islam, anything related to, there's a focus on the Abrahamic dynamic. So there's a particular animosity towards those entities. And there's also this feigned atheism. So there's a pretending that individuals are atheists, when in fact, what they really are revering are traditional African religions. And so if someone is not of a traditional African religion, then they are considered despised. And so there's also a dynamic with sex or gender, and it varies. So you might see either despising or deifying black, quote unquote, males or females. And so you might hear, putting women up on a pedestal, or you might hear putting males up on a pedestal. There's also this dynamic of feigned benevolence and well-meaning, and this is basically used as a justification for the behaviors. And so there's this people putting themselves on a pedestal and telling themselves that it is their duty to correct other people. It is their duty to bring these other people in line. It is their duty to rid people of any of their false notions about God or anything else. It's their duty to rid people of any thoughts of being anything other than, quote unquote, African. And within this is this political rhetoric about unity everything, and back to Africa everything. And so you see this pro-Africa, quote, kind of black power dynamic. It's not real though. And then that's coupled with an anti-American black dynamic. And again, you see these confederacies that are going on. So you see these collectives, and they're linked almost like little webs, and so there's also what's really prevalent, and it really stands out, is this pseudo-intellectualism. And not only is there pseudo-intellectualism, but there is also this dynamic where the individuals are targeting other people to identify them as pseudo-intellectual. And so there is this extreme obsessive dynamic going on where individuals are finding fault with everything that anyone else does. Again, very narcissistic. And there is a tendency to focus on being an expert in African history. Rarely ever is there a lot of discussion about the future. A lot of it is about the past, about history and where people have been. The we was kings, Kang's kind of dynamic, without focusing on the fact that they are often presenting as a royal pain in the present for many people. And there's very little, if any, focus on actual concrete building, moving forward. There's very little talk of that. There's very little action in that direction. The majority of action seems to be destructive. And so again, that sort of enemy from within dynamic. There's a lot of oppositionality, a lot of defiance, a lot of arguments, constantly arguing and provoking people, insisting on having these debates. I'm going to say this: by the time someone reaches 25 and they have left college, if they want to debate, they need to go to law school and become attorneys and do something good for society, do something good for the community. Sitting around on YouTube, debating constantly, having arguments constantly, that's counterproductive. And in terms of maturity, that is developmentally inappropriate. And it is developmentally inappropriate in terms of what should be provided for those young people who are coming up and who are on YouTube watching all of this. One of the things that I started putting was a caveat in terms of behavior in the comment section, not saying anything or doing anything that you would not want a 9-year-old repeating in that 3rd grade classroom. I think that people often forget the fact that children are online, and they are online unsupervised, and they are having a field day observing all of this because they are getting to observe all sorts of adult conversation that they typically would not be able to observe. Often adults would be aware of their presence, but the children are almost lurking in the comment section and watching all sorts of things that they shouldn't be watching. And many things are not adult restricted when they should be. And so there's a lot of behavior that is going on. So not just the targeting, but some of it's just extremely irresponsible in terms of our responsibility as adults in the community, in society. It is highly inappropriate. And there are things that need to be done in society. And when people are distracted by this foolishness, it takes away from progress. And so those individuals who are doing this are taking away from their own progress, because this is certainly not edifying. There's nothing that's exhorting about it. There's nothing really beneficial about it in the long run. And it's definitely not beneficial or exhorting or encouraging in any sort of way for those who are on the receiving end, or even those who are witnessing it. Sometimes just witnessing that foolishness is a problem. And so individuals also are involved in mess disturbing, so just provoking things, either provoking it in the comment section. So sometimes it's the people who are the quote unquote fans. They're fanning the flames of this foolishness. One of the things that is noted is that people are basically talking entirely too much. It's almost as if people have forgotten that they are actually online and that they have an entire world audience. They are doing too much. I think, as the young people call it, they're being very extra. And so in talking too much and doing too much, you have other people actually join in. And in some instances, it's unclear as to why people feel that they can talk so much and do so much, almost as if they feel like they are above the law. And quite frankly, they may be. But the issue is that that's what it looks like. That's the dynamic that is going on. There's a little talking too much when one probably should be quiet on the internet, and there's doing too much. There is that being extra. There are people who are running around on the internet basically acting as if they are Black Klansmen. They have no reason to be concerned about anything else because they have taken up that role. There is a lot of slandering and libelous behavior, often couched in homoeroticism and homophobic types of dynamics, and seeing nothing wrong with slandering people. Seeing nothing wrong with engaging in libelous behavior, defaming people, tearing people's characters down. They don't care that someone's children may see this stuff. They don't care. There are no behavioral controls going on. There are no controls on those mouths. None. And then there's often this dynamic of projection that is going on. And so individuals are taking things that are perhaps uncomfortable in self and then projecting them onto other people. And putting this stuff in writing, if you look at some of those subject lines, it's horrific. And it is only by grace that individuals have not run into serious problems with this behavior and some of the things that they say about people. One of the things, if you're going to put someone's name in the subject line, you probably want to make sure that whatever it is you're saying in your video is exhorting in some way, shape, form, or fashion. But if the individual has done something wrong and you want to confront that specific wrong behavior, then that's fine. But in general, when you put someone's name in the comment section, it should be focused on teaching and learning and elevating and clarifying some things. If you can't say anything positive, in many instances, it's best to say nothing at all, unless it's a very serious issue. There was an issue a while back where there were some comments made. I remember the one about the grandparent being a slave trader, and some of the dynamics that were going on with some, again, intra-racial, inter-ethnic slurs. And so when that type of thing is going on, it's fine to address that. But in general, when you put someone's name in the comment section, when you put someone's name in the subject line, there needs to be something. If you want to be diplomatic about it, there needs to be something edifying that you say in your commentary, or perhaps it's best that you say nothing at all. I'm unclear about how much money people are making from YouTube because I don't do the monetizing thing, so I'm not clear about that. But I doubt very seriously that it is worth what may come from some of those dynamics.
You got to pay back. Revenge. I'm mad.
One of the reasons that these dynamics are persisting for many people is that there is a cycle. And so when one person does something, then there is this wounded ego and the perceived need to strike out again. And so this cycle goes on and on and on. And because all of this is tinged with narcissism, egocentrism, lack of empathy, it continues on, and the cycle pretty much does not stop. There's very little motivation for this to stop. And this is a dangerous place to be in. It is not healthy, and it's definitely not helpful. And so after a while, you have to start to look at the cost and benefit in terms of that behavior. And we're going to talk about some of that cost for all of the benefit that many people believe they've been reaping. You know, the interesting thing is that many of these things probably would not be taking place if there was no monetary gain. And so there's a lot of what is identified as cyberbullying that is going on. And what cyberbullying looks like, to give you an idea so that you can have sort of a framework and perhaps understand better what you might be seeing on YouTube. There's usually a ringleader, and there are willing or duped enablers. And there's a cult-like structure and following to the whole dynamic. And there's also this sort of external focus versus an internal focus. So there's very little focus on the emotional dynamics, the cognitive dynamics that are giving rise to the behavior. People are almost on automatic pilot. And one of the things, particularly more recently, that keeps coming up is this idea of duping and scamming people and extorting people. And this doesn't always have to involve money. Sometimes people might threaten someone, wanting them to change something on their channel, change something about their content. And if they don't do it, there's a threat that they're going to expose them, they're going to defame them, they're going to do something to them. And so all of this is cyberbullying. There's the harassing, the defaming, the shaming, and then there are many people that are engaged in just straight up stalking, cyber stalking. So they'll create multiple channels with all of these aliases, and they will flood the comment section. And so one of the things that many people might want to do is, set their channel to approve comments. And so make sure that the comments are automatically held. Otherwise, you might come to a comment section that is all over the place. It can become tedious when you have individuals doing this multi-channel cyber stalking dynamic, and then they get their friends all involved, and they're all on your channel sending comments and spamming and flaming and doing all of these different things. And they have all of these different names, and so it's very difficult to keep track of what is going on. But these are the dynamics that make up cyberbullying, and we're going to talk about how important this is, because I think many people think that this is some laughing simple matter, and they're really kind of getting off on doing it, and most bullies do get off on bullying. But we're going to talk about why this is not prudent. And even though people may feel like they've gotten away with it, that may not continue. One of the things that keeps coming up is that people are insisting that they have a right to free speech. They have a right to do whatever it is that they would like to do, that they should not let anyone tell them what to do. This is a very juvenile behavior. That's a very juvenile thought pattern when people are acting out online without any sense that they should have any checks or balances. And so what I'm sharing with you right now is an audio transcript. It was a discussion. If you go to the FBI website, you can see what the thinking is about this. And so the FBI is basically saying they're seeing more cyberbullying complaints through the Internet Crime Complaint Center. I don't think that people realize that there is actually a complaint center that people may use to complain to the FBI about cyberbullying. And one of the reasons why the FBI is involved in this is because you're talking about going across jurisdictions. And so you're talking about from state to state. You might be talking about some international cyberbullying that's going on. And they're also involved because it often involves civil rights violations. And so a lot of people are engaged in this, and they're not thinking about people perhaps complaining. But even more important, they're not thinking about the fact that law enforcement is on the internet. And it's unclear why people are behaving as if they do not know that. They are behaving as if they are completely unaware that law enforcement would be on the internet. monitoring these types of things. And so they are definitely not unaware that it's going on. So they are pretty much aware when individuals are participating in harassing and humiliating other people. People believe, though, that when they're on platforms like YouTube and things like that, that they're anonymous. But let me let you in on something. The field of law is working diligently to figure out how to balance those privacy rights with the needs of the public. And so there are all sorts of things that are going on right now to find better ways to provide for the safety of the public in light of people having these privacy rights. And so a lot of people are doing things based upon this belief that everything that they do in their little bubble with this little alias that they have is protecting them. And that is incorrect. And for those of you who are unaware, let's quickly go over what a hate crime is. And so we've been talking about what it looks like when people have been collecting to engage in behaviors related to discrete demographic groups. And so what a hate crime is it basically looks at traditional crimes, and it could be any, depends on the jurisdiction, it could be any crime. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be as serious as many people might be thinking. It's a crime. And then there's that added element of bias. And so what they're looking to see is, was bias related to things like ethnicity, related to things like religion, related to things like race, sex, gender? Was that a motivating factor for the crime? Was that a motivating factor for the victimization? So if someone's engaged in cyber stalking, are they stalking people because of their religion? Are they stalking people because of their race? Are they stalking people because of their gender, because of their sex, because of their sexual orientation, because of any of those things? Is it related to bias? And even though law enforcement is mindful of the issue of freedom of speech, people sometimes don't understand this. The law is looking to balance rights. And so, yes, people have a right to freedom of speech in many instances. However, other people have the right to be free from abuse. And so there has to be a balancing of those rights. And so you can see that the FBI and law enforcement, they are very mindful of this. And I know some people probably think, well, they never do anything when there's a big major case related to a person who is quote unquote black and they're victimized. And so some people feel like they can push the envelope. But who wants to be that test case to find out, oh, you mean that black people can be accused and convicted of a hate crime against other black people, quote unquote black people? Well, yes, that can happen. And a person is not just simply a quote unquote black person. You have ethnicity, you have religion, you have sexual orientation, you have gender. And sometimes there are comments that are targeting people because of the perception of them being a certain way. The perception that they identify as a particular ethnicity or a particular religion. And so as soon as, and you might want to check, you might want to look at some of your subject lines and review some of your content to see if you have been targeting people based upon that. And those of you who've been victims of that, you might want to look to see, have you been victimized either individually or as a part of your ethnic group or religious group based upon that demographic identity? Now, of course, one of the things that happens is sometimes, individuals, when they're listening to someone who's doing some sort of lecture or teaching, they might feel like they know more than the person who is teaching. And sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. And in instances when they don't, sometimes life will learn them. That's an old phrase from elders when they say life will learn you, same as, life will teach you. And so one of the things to remember is that for the FBI, hate crimes are a priority right now. And so they are looking at things like crimes motivated by racial, religious, gender, sexual orientation, any type of prejudice along those lines. And so I will tell you that things related to religion, so if people are targeting people because they are Islamic, they are targeting people because they're Hebrew, they're targeting people because they're Christian, because they're Hare Krishna, because they're Hindu, if people are targeting people for any of those reasons, then they may fall under that umbrella. That behavior may fall under that umbrella. And people believe often that they're online. They're not doing anything really. They're just joking, or they're just teasing, or you really want to give some of that behavior a second thought. Is it something that you would do? One of the ways to help is it something that you would do in a normal workplace, knowing that everyone is seeing it? Is it something that you would do just generally in public? Is it something that you want your children doing? And so there are all sorts of little tests that people can give themselves to determine whether or not it's behavior that they should or should not continue. And those of you who are on the receiving end of that, you might want to also start to think about that in the same way. And for some of you, you might need to seek legal counsel. You might need to get the services of an attorney to help you out. But of course, in these instances, when we're talking about crime, you don't need a personal attorney, because when you're talking about crime, the attorney is the state, the attorney is the government. And so your attorney would be the prosecuting attorney. And so there would be no need to acquire your own independent attorney unless you were seeking civil liability and damages. I wanted to just share something really quickly and important. Sometimes when people talk about their First Amendment rights, they talk about that on YouTube. There are no First Amendment rights per se on YouTube. And First Amendment rights, there are limits. There are limits to all rights. And so just to give you an example, it's not okay to falsely yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Some people think they can do that as a big joke. Because it will endanger the safety of others potentially, that freedom will receive an override. And so that would not be something that the courts would protect. And so you have to be very careful about your First Amendment right, or your perception of your First Amendment right, and the rights of others to be free from harm. You know, we have been talking for a while now about these red flags, about the psychological issues, about the legal issues that are related to these dynamics that are going on in social media. And so hopefully people are starting to see that many of these behaviors, and these dynamics, even though they may have been overlooked over time, I know that people, they have their channels taken, or they're in what people call Facebook jail. But what is more important is not a channel being destroyed. What is more important is about what people are doing to themselves. Sometimes people think when they abuse other people that the people who are being abused are the only ones who are being harmed. However, when people engage in behavior that is not healthy, that is not encouraging, not exhorting, not uplifting, not fulfilling in terms of human potential, not only is the person harmed that they are seeking to harm, they themselves are harmed by this dynamic. And it might not just be legally harmed, it's also psychologically harmed. In terms of social relationships, there's harm in terms of those social relationships. Because some of those relationships will not be as healthy as they possibly could be. Now, again, this isn't talking about unity. As a matter of fact, there will not be any push from Dr. McCarthy about any forms of unity. There is no belief that an abuser and an abused need to have any relationship whatsoever with each other. And so really it's a matter of learning how to keep one's hands to one's self. And for a lighthearted look at that, there is a video of a little boy named Caden Bennett on YouTube, and it's about his relationship with the little boy named Johnny in kindergarten when he's learning the no bullying rules. And so, of course, in the classroom, the no bullying rule is usually you don't hit back. And sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes people do hit back. And so little Caden has a little story about the teacher's no bullying policy and Caden's no bullying policy. And we'll put the link down below so that you can see and hear what Caden has to say about Caden's little no bullying policy in kindergarten. And as promised, for those of you who learn best by scripture, we've been just listening to a chant by Andre 3000, chanting Hey Yah. And for those of you for whom this is the Sabbath, we're going to approach this from that vantage point. And so some scripture for you to keep in mind, both as a person who might be engaged in this behavior and those who might be witnessing this behavior and those who might be on the receiving end. One thing to note, regardless of what people are saying, if people are being menacing and they're engaging in behavior that is unhealthy and unhelpful, simply remember that a tree is known by its fruit. And so you don't have to worry about trying to figure out whether or not the person is doing it on purpose or whether or not the person is doing it to be hurtful. It really doesn't matter the motivation. One of the things you want to think about is that you can pretty much tell the motivation by the fruit that comes from that tree. The tree may bear some fruit that might roll downhill a little bit, but it's not going to fall far from that tree. And so you can look at that, and that is Luke 6:43 through 45. And you also have the dynamic of if you are on the receiving end of it, do not answer a fool according to their folly, because a lot of this, not a lot, all of it is foolishness. It's complete and utter foolishness, and it is just so highly inappropriate for individuals who are talking about building community. There's no way to build community when half of the community or even 3/4 of the community would have to be subjected to abuse just to belong in the community. And so in many instances, for the most part, most of these groups that are being targeted probably might want to think about stepping back away from all of this unity and just getting themselves together, getting their collective together. And so if people are Hebrew, working on the Hebrews, if people are Islamic, working on Islam, if people are Christian, working on being a Christian, if people are American, working on being American, if people are Caribbean, working on being Caribbean, if people are indigenous, working on being indigenous, if people are from continental Africa, working on being continental African, it does not mean that everyone has to come together. Most people can't get along with all of their family members, let alone all of the brown people around the globe. And so that's really sort of delusional thinking. I mean, it goes on, and I know it sounds good, all of this unity and coming together and power in numbers and all of that. But in these types of instances and in the climate that we're in and what's going on YouTube and social media, there is no need for all of that unity when people are being abused. Now, if you find some common ground, that's a different story, but that's not what's going on here. If that was what was going on, there would be no need for this extremely long, record-breaking video. And so you want to, no matter what, think about getting wisdom. It doesn't matter whether you're on the perpetrating end, you've been doing these things, or you've been on the receiving end. Get some wisdom about what's going on. Get some understanding about what is going on. And for those individuals who are pretty much bent on continuing down this path pridefully, because I do hear a lot of pride in some of these dynamics. I hear pride and envy. Envy is sort of jealousy coupled with the desire to destroy. That's a very Freudian dynamic. But with pride pretty much goes before destruction and goes before a fall, as does a haughty spirit. And so sometimes it's difficult for some people when their ego is really wrapped up in it. It's hard for them to say, I'm sorry. It's hard for them to stop. But you might want to give yourself permission to stop and rise above it and become a leader in showing other people the way in terms of how to treat other human beings. It doesn't matter that it's on YouTube, and sometimes people can be, not see it as a personal dynamic because there's just a screen, but there's a human being behind all of that. And so there may be another way to be a leader. Sometimes people want to pretend that they are Charlemagne and want to do that, but that's pretty much Charlemagne's job. And when we're talking about YouTube, that is no one's job. And so again, there are other ways to be a leader. And even Charlemagne apologizes, so when he does things, and that might be hurtful. So he does sometimes apologize. And so, take that as a cue that even though that's his job, it's to sort of roast people, that's not anyone's job on YouTube. And so, really consider the possibility of taking a leadership role in a different way, not in a bullying way, particularly given the age of most of the people that we are talking about. And that message from Ice Cube is very timely. Hopefully people will start to think about checking themselves before they wreck themselves on YouTube. There is probably nothing worth it on YouTube. People might think temporarily that some of the behavior and the dynamics are worth it. It's fun, but you are encouraged to check yourself. And as we wrap this up, let's chat a little bit about how you can engage in self-censoring so that you do not get in a situation that's going to be difficult for yourself or for other people in terms of engagement online, having some sort of diplomacy. One of the things is to simply ask yourself this question. The thing that I am getting ready to produce, is it going to be edifying? That's the question. Is it going to be helpful? Are people going to feel uplifted by whatever it is that I am doing? Are people going to learn something? Are people going to be in a better space than they were prior to having experienced whatever the content is, whether the content is a video or whether the content is a comment? Will people feel like they have been on the receiving end of something that is beneficial, that is holistically beneficial? Is it something that is going to help them to be a better person? And ultimately, is it going to help you to be a better person? So when you listen to the replay of your own videos, do you actually feel uplifted? or are you simply getting a temporary gratification for those I gotchas and those types of dynamics? And so just ask yourself those questions. And also, very important, ask yourself if the messages that you are giving are messages that would help you if you heard them. If someone was saying these things to you, would you feel edified? Would you be inspired towards growth for having experienced the message? This is the longest video that has ever been done, so congratulations if you made it through. It's amazing that I made it through. So hopefully this has been helpful, and hopefully this is going to help someone to stay out of trouble on YouTube and stay out of trouble on Facebook and all of these other social media platforms. If someone needs some excitement, perhaps they can find some other ways to have that excitement. Go out and play some sports, play with some children, run with the dog, ride a bike, go bungee jumping, something other than what has been going on. And find some ways to reach across some of those boundaries if that's what you want to do. And also, one of the important things to do is to have empathy and perspective taking. Remember that you don't know everything. There's always something that you can learn. And you don't know everything about everyone. No one knows everything about self. And so one of the ways to proceed is to acknowledge that you don't know everything, and that you don't know everything about someone else, and allow other people to have their own self-determination without being obstructed by you. Remember that each person has a path to walk. One of the things that happened in the Civil War, which was really interesting, was that, the South wanted to separate. They wanted to have self-determination. But inside of that desire to have self-determination was the desire to hold on to people that they had enslaved. And so there wasn't a genuine desire for self-determination. It was just a selfish desire for self-determination. And so oftentimes when people are they're mistreating other people, they are pretty insistent that the people who are being mistreated stick around for the mistreatment. And so I would encourage you to give some of that second thought, whether you're the person who's thinking about sticking around for the mistreatment, or whether or not you are the person who is pulling for that. Also, on YouTube, one convenient thing is the block button. And so you can block things, but the thing is that you can't really stop people from producing different content. You can only respond after they have produced this content. And so you need to focus on you. And perhaps for some of you, you might want to consider getting off of YouTube and getting off of social media. Clearly, it is a platform that some people are using for income, but sometimes that income, that benefit may not outweigh the detriment. Again, thank you for making it through this, and hopefully it was something that some of you were able to receive. If you were not able to hear when the messages came from other people, and also want to send a thank you out to individuals such as LENON Honor and Dr. Rick Wallace and Pharaoh Said That, and Attorney Shabazz for bringing some of these issues up that have been going on, bringing those issues to the forefront. And hopefully the younger folks, they're not that much younger, but hopefully the younger folks can hear it and can grow from it and benefit from it, and take the initiative to turn this thing around. As Pearl Clage said in her book, turn the ships around, turn the ships around. This time, turn the ships around. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.